Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Thanks for joining the conversation so far, and be sure to find us on all of the typical platform studios and at our YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe and leave your comments in the section below, and we will get to them in subsequent episodes. So, kicking us off, I want to turn the conversation today to the topic of plagiarism, both why it's so difficult to kind of detect in real time, maybe what some of the legacy systems are for detecting it, and then how we and others might be using AI to help mitigate some of these risks. So, Shashi, why don't you kick us off? You've been in the research and publishing space for a long time. Just kind of speak broadly about plagiarism. How big of a concern is it maybe really? And then kind of what are maybe some solutions that we or others could maybe work to build to solve some of these issues?
Yeah, starting with the news, Claudine Gay's dismissal as president of Harvard is the most notable, and underneath political story is activist Bill Ackman, who has been at odds with Claudine Gay, and based on her testimony and her responses, her congressional testimony, and so. In the back and forth of the story, Bill Ackman's wife is a researcher, Neri Oxman, who has her own publication record, and some people have now gone after Neri Oxman's publication record as having plagiarism, and so there is a Twitter or X feud underway at the moment. With Bill Ackman saying he's willing to fund startups who will find plagiarism, and is now scalp hunting for everyone at MIT and Harvard, essentially. So there's a feud here, and plagiarism is the tool of choice, not necessarily for the plagiarism itself, but just as a weapon to go after the other guys. So it seems that's my interpretation of it. The history of plagiarism is long. There have been many instances of plagiarism. Plagiarism detection is a thorny problem. There are tools out there that attempt to solve it, but they are imprecise. For example, there are many instances where people write entirely new material off the cuff in front of other people, in front of an audience, only to have the plagiarism detectors in real time say there is mild to moderate plagiarism in the content. So this can easily create false positives and false negatives, and it's a thorny problem for sure. How we end up solving that, AI will certainly play an important role in how this goes forward. But the norms itself of plagiarism are also not entirely transparent, and the cultural differences are significant. So, for example, in some cultures, particularly, for example, in India, we've had a lot of Indian students progress through the academy who have just a different standard of what is plagiarism because of a cultural norm that may be a bit different. And so that's something to keep in mind as we kind of cast judgment or instantaneous gut reactions of plagiarism. Is the tools themselves to detect this aren't very precise, and there are wide-ranging norms of what is and isn't the proper way to give someone credit.
Yeah, I think building off of that, it is obviously the responsibility of the author and the shared responsibility of publishing houses, reviewers, etc., to be able to catch and mitigate any of that accidental plagiarism that you're kind of talking about. But it seemingly is a somewhat non-feasible ask to have someone check every word that they've written. Because like as you're describing it in real time, you can be kind of generating words kind of on the spot, in real time, not realize that you're kind of almost word for word recapitulating the efforts of others. And obviously this is significantly different than the stark contrast that is outright plagiarism for just the sake of copying someone's work to accelerate the progress of your own. And it's difficult to distinguish those two. So it's kind of pulling at the thread of how AI might enable some new solutions. I don't know, Zach or Lakshay, do you want to take that thread?
Yeah, the thing that's interesting here is that I kind of think about the way we've seen AI used in academics and school settings already, where a lot of people the prevailing concern is hey, is this AI generated content? Is a student doing original work, right? And even in the case of an AI tool, like the AI comes with a lot of false positives saying like, there's a period and like there's a startup that was promoting like, hey, like we're going to detect AI generated content, but it was firing off false positives all the time. Right. And so I think like the thing to me that's going to be interesting, I guess, when detecting plagiarism is there's a lot of nuances into like what constitutes plagiarism, right? Like paraphrasing without citing your source is still plagiarism, right? Directly quoting, of course, is like the most obvious thing, but then we kind of get into like the interesting bit of like how far does a paraphrase have to go before it's considered plagiarism, right? That feels like a very, very gray question that I think like it'd be very hard to just provide to a machine and say, this is like the correct answer, yes, no, binary, this is plagiarism, this is not. It kind of seems like the best kind of way to go about it is just like build a system that's able to like find relevant source text and kind of maybe just like train like a model saying like off of like a bunch of experts saying, hey, this is sufficiently different and correctly cited, or this is like directly quoted, but like very clearly from this text, and being able to then like rely on experts to then give that sort of feedback saying, hey, this is plagiarism by the common sense versus not. But it seems complicated inevitably just by the fact that, again, plagiarism is something that has a lot of grayness to it.
I think building on that, just thinking about my own experience in research and in science, in some ways, I feel like it's a little bit easier in engineering to avoid the plagiarism because a lot of the work and a lot of the data that we're generating is kind of by definition unique. It's just you kind of one-off data sets coming out of our lab and those kind of things. So sure, when it actually comes to the writing and publishing, we have to be careful not to be kind of recreating someone else's text, but the actual data that is kind of building the central crux or the central kind of thesis of our arguments is kind of being generated by us. So it just feels a little bit more black and white when you juxtapose that to something like the humanities, in which you're kind of just trying to make new strides, novel findings, that kind of thing, based on layers and layers of kind of knowledge, right? So you're just kind of compiling thoughts, kind of recreating thoughts, those kind of things, versus actually determining new empirical data and evidence, those kind of things. Zach, any thoughts with regards to this?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the other side of that, Damon, is that how many words in a sequence constitute plagiarism? And in technical fields, it's very difficult to say. There are just standards of convention of how you say something. So if you use a 3 or 4 word sequence, that is the standard way of stating something. It would constitute quote unquote plagiarism according to some detectors or some thresholds, whereas in some other phrasing, it would just be unconventional to say what you said in that way. So you would need to really state it in the exact way that your readers are expecting, who are people in your field who are used to that same phrasing. So it's just very difficult to draw a line that feels like a standardized line.
I completely agree. And extending that thought slightly, I don't think that a simple word for word matching is going to go nearly far enough. There has to be some sort of semantics involved to see how many new thoughts are being contributed by this kind of body of work versus, I think, piecing out individual sentences and just checking for overlap. So I think that's well said. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think something interesting, generally the logic of what you said, technical fields would be a little harder or a little more black and white would be true. However, in my personal experience, I'm actually working on a paper right now where we developed this new mathematical formula that we thought was new, unique, fantastic. We go back and look up some previous publications. Oh, wait, someone in the 40s had come up with that exact same idea. So like a lot of the times, many times it can be that you think you have something unique, something you came up with off the cuff, but you just don't realize someone else did it. So that kind of ties into a little bit that circles around the black and white versus gray. In preparation for this podcast, one of the articles I read talked about the fact that plagiarism is too broad of a word. And really, it should be really like broken up into like almost like felonies and misdemeanors. If you think of plagiarism felony, right, is that Shashi wrote a paper, I took his core content, I made it sound like I came up with it myself. Like that's like very bad. No one's really going to ever argue that like you shouldn't take someone else's idea and present it as your own intentionally. However, if you get down to some of the things that without getting too specific into like the things that were cited in the news, some of the examples are like someone forgetting some quotation marks or like not properly citing someone who was like cited previously in the text. These are things that like, please raise your hand if you've ever forgotten to attach an attachment to an email. those are sloppy mistakes. It's things you shouldn't be doing. Yes. However, everyone makes little mistakes here and again. And I know, and I love the fact that at large, people like assume that academics are very precise, very good at what they do. A lot of time that's true. However, academics are still people. Writing a large academic document is very tedious. And kind of like as you write something, the words kind of blend together. You see things in your head and you kind of read, you've read text before and you accidentally had the word the twice in a row. You don't notice it because your brain doesn't see it. You get to that level of detail, especially when you're pulling back. Some of these things in the news were over 15 years ago. Computers 15 years ago don't do what they do now. So I think that kind of the way that we think about plagiarism as a whole is like, yes, there are very bad cases of plagiarism. Then there are others that are like general sloppiness. It's not 100% perfect. We've all read books that have typos in them. It's almost to that level. That's kind of my general opinion is a lot of the times when you think about this kind of thing is what is the intent behind it? If the intention had malice, sure, that person deserves to be reprimanded appropriately. But there's some things that's just not, it's not even sloppy. It's just missing a few kind of minor things that I don't really think you should be pushing towards calling someone out for things that are not actually meaningful.
I agree with that, Zach. And I would say this word plagiarism is intended to mean someone is a cheater or illegitimate in their accomplishments or in their field. And I agree, it's sort of a catch-all for a variety of things, some of which may be based on intent, like you're saying, and some may just be accidental, or you just didn't quote this one thing, but you quoted them thoroughly throughout the other text, and that prompts me to think, given where we are with technology, I mean, most of our publication process, including the way we format research papers, is based on a paper-based printing process, where we had a literal person standing at a printing press with specific character markers that they sort of manually printed on lots of pieces of paper and then automatically printed, but still really fundamentally the same way. A lot of the formatting that we use and even the citation process is kind of a derivative of that historical precedent. Perhaps this calls for a re-examination of the standard practices we use for citations and how we go about that, so that we may be able to more conveniently and with a less error-prone dynamic be able to quote, if I'm quoting Zach throughout my paper, to say, Zach will be quoted throughout this paper, and I will denote Zach's contributions in this way, so that it's less likely I forget or didn't include the quote marks.
I think jumping on that, two thoughts come to mind. Number one, in science specifically, given the various formatting styles of various journals, it can be incredibly easy to make a mistake when trying to format for one or the other because of kind of a lack of attention to detail or something like that when converting text from one format to the other. The other thing I am wondering, based just on the comment that Shasha you just made, is I actually find the way that scientific articles are cited right now to be a bit cumbersome, meaning there is no reason why I need to jump from the body of the text into the bibliography section to then go out and find that resource, right? A simple hypertext on kind of the part that is quoted or the part that is cited would be much more convenient, such that I could open, a secondary browser tab or something like that and follow up that thread of information kind of in real time. And again, that probably is mostly just due to the legacy nature of that process. Like you're saying, hypertext simply isn't a function of physically printed, manuscripts. And so, it had to be cited in a certain way that has kind of probably been carried forward when in fact it could be replaced, in real time with highlighting of the word, launching out to another tab in which you can kind of investigate further. So any closing thoughts on plagiarism or anything similar before we move on?
Yeah, I guess so. One example, so Turnitin.com, it was very big when I was in high school and throughout college. I've always kind of viewed that as the gold standard of plagiarism checking in terms of turning in works and having it check it. Back when I was in high school, the mid-aughts, late aughts, it was doing some level of AI because it was taking this text and automatically kind of giving feedback on whether or not it's plagiarized. I'd be curious and kind of love to see behind the scenes from Turnitin.com. What were they doing back then? What are they doing now today? Shashi, I think you brought up Authenticate. Is there software that journals are using to kind of check things? If they're the kind of forefront of the plagiarism AI, what is it that they're doing that makes that what are the levers that kind of make it better or worse? Is it training sets? Is it how we define plagiarism? Is it access to enough databases? I'm curious to see what are the big things that are going to kind of change and move the levers in terms of using AI to find plagiarism.
Yeah, it's a great question for them. Maybe this is a prompt for a conversation with them. If anybody from Turnitin is tuning in, let's hear more about how you're using AI to solve the plagiarism topic, especially given how important that topic has become.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody for all of that. I think moving on, let's change gears somewhat significantly here, and let's do a little bit of speculation given the news of the GPT store from OpenAI releasing this week. Scholar AI has existed as a GPT since OpenAI's developer conference. So, Lakshay, why don't we start with you? Just kind of what you think we're going to see with the GPT store. There's some speculation on different ways in which GPTs might be able to monetize themselves. So, just comment as you will.
Yeah, I'm really, I guess, like, having had conversations with OpenAI folks before, like, it's interesting because it always seemed that GPT stores were like, the way that they view it internally, or GPTs in general, is supposed to be like a layman friendly product. Like, you're not a technical person, you're not building a tool. Like, this is something that's very much meant to be spun up on your own to then like do something very specific for yourself, prompt in a very specific way, interact with very specific documents. You create your own, you call it a day, and you move on, right? And so I think like one thing that I'm anticipating is going to happen with the GPT store is that they might have like GPTs out there and like, oh, these are the popular ones. Like, I know there's a very popular one called Grimoire, which is like for coding. That's mostly just taking a lot of the prompting that like GPT like allows you to do, right? Helps you out code. And I think the main like cool feature of it is that like lets you output that code somewhere, right? I think one thing that's going to happen very quickly is there will be like an emergence of kind of like the top players, same as there would be in just any other app store. But I think one thing that I'm expecting to happen pretty soon is this idea of like personalizing a published GPT for yourself. Like, someone could take the Scholar AI GPT. I really, really anticipate that there's a feature where you just like switch it up a little bit. Like, you get to pull the prompting, you edit it a little bit, and then make it your own thing. And it's just the way that like stuff stays popular and gets popular is how many conversations it has and maybe how many times it's been like refurbished into something more personal. It's just like, it's weird to me to think about a GPT store insofar that like a lot of GPTs, and the vast majority, like 95, 96% of them, are just going to be people prompting a system, really. Like, no tech under the hood. And so I'm curious what's going to happen with GPTs that are like functionalized, like ours, like any other plugin that's pre-existed, as far as, like holding spots in a store and making themselves broadcasted, even though it kind of seems like the intent is for people to be customizing.
I think that's well said. It feels like the GPT at the baseline level or the basal level is an opportunity for people to become amateur prompt engineers and then use the expertise of others who are prompt engineering the model in a way that is very effective for a specific set of tasks. Like you said, there's going to be others like ours that are kind of amplified or supplemented with accessory technologies, like our ability to kind of search the academic corpus, et cetera. So very interested to kind of see the developments. Josh, you'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what you think is going to happen here, maybe the implications for businesses. There's a extended thread I want to pull on, but want to let you go first.
It would be interesting to see OpenAI focus on an app store, on not dissimilar from the Apple App Store. I think that kind of framework that is geared toward businesses who are willing to make a substantial tech investment, kind of on the back of what Lakshay said, willing to invest in deeper technical features, have a way to build and monetize on their platform. That would be really interesting. And I think it would attract a lot of professional engineering talent into the ecosystem. I think their thought process so far has been geared toward B2C, the end consumer, and trying to get as much of that market share as possible, which leaves open room for someone else to build that kind of professional B2B based app store. So I think it's an open market opportunity. OpenAI has the market share leadership to take that on first, but they haven't yet, and to be determined whether the App Store is going to be a step in that direction, or maybe not a full-fledged step. So eager to see.
Yeah, I think Lakshay and Shashi did a nice job kind of summarizing that. I guess something I'll be curious to see is, in terms of winners and losers, I think some of it's going to depend on these people making GPTs, us included. What's the business model look like? How do you extract value from it? If it's something that this is going to be primarily open source, it's hard to charge for, then I don't know if businesses are going to have as much incentive, versus if they're able to become a little more specialized, you're able to make sure that like other people aren't using your API or something. So like, I guess I think it kind of depends on how OpenAI views it. If they're going to be supporting businesses trying to build businesses around these apps, or is it more of a very collective, let's build a community of people helping each other with ChatGPT? So I guess I don't have a good feel for which way they're going to go. Lakshay, Shashi, feel free to chime in if you think but I think that'll kind of depend on who ends up using it. Is it business friendly, or is it more community friendly?
Yeah, like something I keep coming back to is that, like, to me, like in an idealized like sci-fi world where like everyone has like an AI assistant, like whether it's like a her type thing, or just like, like any cyber concept where there's some like personal assistant, like the way it kind of felt that things were going, especially with plugins, is that like there's this singular system, you talk to it, you don't know like what it really is, and it kind of chooses the correct things to do to achieve the outcomes you want, right? So like if I were just like crafting some like story that starts with OpenAI and ends in that future, the thing that I would be doing is like making one model that sees the entire list of GPTs and like chooses which GPTs to kind of like pull together to pull off a set of goals, right? And so right now, in like the GPT creator, when you look at deeper functionality, right? If I were to say, hey, I'm on a diet, like starting this year, I want to set up like food delivery for myself. That's kind of doing that, right? I'd imagine that there's one GPT, or rather one set of actions connected to some GPT that's responsible for like diet planning. And then a second GPT connected to like Instacart or something. And then those two end up getting merged into one thing that then I speak to. It takes care of all the actions for me. I don't care who's doing it. I don't care if that's Instacart. I don't care if it's MyFitnessPal, whatever it may be. That comes back to me. I'm just talking to one assistant, and real world stuff happens and changes, right? And so I think like the way GPTs are going to be structured in the short term is that every company, or every like, I guess, early stage developer that's kind of like playing with these things is going to have one GPT with their set of actions isolated. But it feels like the way that it would go in an ideal case is those set of actions and their prompts are kind of like made available to OpenAI, and they kind of summon the right ones into the correct circumstances. So in a way, like a GPT is just like an abstraction on what are a collection of APIs, if that makes sense.
It's almost an abstraction of an abstraction, right? Just like multiple levels, such that you are interacting with one top level thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'd get paid based on the number of times your APIs get used.
Exactly. That's what I think.
Yeah. I would pay substantially more for that system if Scarlett Johansson's voice was was my voice assistant. Just worth saying.
There's a lot of good
She probably wouldn't even have to do any work for it, by the way. Like, she's got so much material out there that you could probably infer her voice, and she would just need to sign off the rights and collect the checks.
I don't know if y'all have played with the like app version of ChatGPT, but it kind of feels like the default voice is actually kind of meant to sound a little bit like her. I'm sure like in like a weird way it's not, but like when I like started talking, I was like, this does sound like her. Like, that's weird. I don't know. Maybe I'll put an OpenAI in some hot water for this, but who cares?
Everything circles back to the plagiarism conversation.
It is prescient, just given as we record this, the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI is still kind of ongoing to see how and who is going to be compensated for the data that kind of ultimately goes to training these models. But just commenting to some of the things that I was hearing out of that conversation, one insidious kind of view of the GPT store is that OpenAI is in effect crowdsourcing A/B test, essentially seeing what GPTs gain traction, such that they can farm the feature set for themselves and then kind of collect it all under the hood for kind of like you're talking about a model that kind of chains together these actions and kind of responses once they know what people are naturally gravitating towards. So I don't know. It'll be an interesting development. I do think that one of their primary goals is to incentivize development on their platform and to increase the amount of people that are developing with the GPT models, whether it be GPT 3.5 or 4 or Turbo or subsequent evolutions of that. But very curious to see what happens. Okay. All right. Sounds great. Moving on from that, do we want to do a little bit of reflection on the Scholar AI Copilot? So as of publication of this podcast, the Scholar AI Copilot will have been out for a bit. Just wondering if anyone has any thoughts to not only how we see kind of these independent web apps existing in the ecosystem that includes things like GPTs on the GPT store, plugins on ChatGPT, the ideas of chaining together these different thoughts and actions, kind of going beyond the keyboard, as Lakshay was alluding to earlier. I know that we've had some interesting learnings thus far with it, whether it be, short-term bug fixes, interesting kind of, ideas, I think, for features, that kind of thing. So, Zach or Lakshay, either one of you want to comment just to kind of state of the web app, positives, negatives, kind of any interesting learnings from that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting building a system that has like LLM pure interfaces. Like obviously like the web app is one piece of like what is like a larger puzzle in the whole scheme of things. I think that there's a lot of interesting learning that's happened so far in that not only do our APIs have to be thoughtful about like what they are doing and like how they're written, whatever, how fast they are, but there is this kind of like new emerging layer of like, how do I get the LLM to do what I'm expecting it to? And how do I know that it's generally doing that job? I think like right now with the ChatGPT, with the GPT and the plugin, like we've kind of like had it pretty standard. Like that was mostly just like my summer, just like trying things, like iterating over and over to see like what generally seemed to be doing a decent job. But even with the web app and the Copilot, that uses GPT Turbo, whereas the others uses like an older version of GPT-4. And even there, even though Turbo is a better model, it acts differently in some cases than the plugin does, which is really strange to me. Especially given that like Turbo should have more context. It should be like reading a lot more. So it kind of feels like there's just like an interesting space that doesn't feel well understood about how my model interacts with text that's given to it and how I can like be deterministic as to what it's doing. I think that's a lot of like what the big motivation behind having web app is that like, even if the LLM is kind of like doing whatever it wants to, like there's opportunities to like validate, to share information, to like transfer knowledge in a way that's not just bound to LLM input, LLM output. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up, especially that will connect both the GPT and the web app together. That'll make it easier and easier to kind of have like almost like a second brain for your research. So that should be coming soon, but hopefully just a lot of different learnings. I think it's both like application interfaces, thinking about LLMs, all sorts of stuff like that.
I want to pause just for a moment and kind of double click on one of the things that you said, and that making these inherently stochastic systems somewhat deterministic is commonly done through a process called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, and that is something that we've worked a lot about. So maybe if you would just provide kind of a several sentence summary here, kind of if you want to give a brief topic of RAG, a brief overview of RAG, by all means do. For those that are curious and want to do further reading, we have several blog posts at scholarai.io that describe RAG in some detail. So please follow up there if you want it. But Lakshay, if you would, just kind of what is RAG, how have we kind of explored it, how are we using it so far, and how does it kind of, provide some level of grounding to these otherwise completely stochastic large language models?
Yeah. So at its like very fundamentally, RAG means like retrieval augmented generation. So LLMs, what they do is generate, right? When you ask it for a prompt, like you go to the model and say, hey, tell me what you know about the production of rice and the shipment of rice, right? It has some training. It goes through its long history of like whatever its model decides the production of rice should be about, prints that out for you, tells it to you, right? But the problem with that is that like that's all stochastic, as Damon was saying, where it's not based on source documents. And that's what RAG's for, where the retrieval bit of it is fundamentally connecting what you would assume is a truthful data source to prepend a lot of that discussion. And a lot of it comes really down to is like, how do you prompt the machine to know which part of what you've retrieved it should be using? And so where we kind of started with Scholar AI and like even like that first video, like that demo video I posted basically a year ago at this point, was fundamentally like, hey, this system doesn't work. RAG didn't really have a name in that, like a popular name in that capacity. What we did is that we took research papers, we pulled them out, made a search database, and handed them to the model to then talk about intelligently. And even that comes with a lot of like complications in that, like, okay, now there's a context window, meaning that if you share too much data that goes beyond the context window, the model will begin to again lose track of things. There's a lot of interesting research, I guess, like kind of in progress as to like how you even know that RAG is doing a good job. Because I mean, it happened to us too, where like we were providing completely truthful, like well-sourced documents, but because of how they're provided or in our own testing, it would just make up details again. It'd make up URLs, it'd hand the wrong stuff. A lot of what's common for kind of validating RAG is kind of two things. One, kind of do a bunch of like standard like search checks where if you have 20 documents, all with a bunch of paragraphs, whatever, and you ask a question, you kind of test the recall and say, hey, did the model talk about the thing I was expecting it to in this collection of documents, right? The second piece of it is how accurately is it summarizing the content, assuming it picked the correct one. And both of those are, I feel like the first is more solved. The second one of like knowing how well a machine is talking about a document, especially since there's a summary, is very, very complicated. What is the most common approach these days is just have two different LLM models basically validating each other, one generating, one reading. And the reading one, presumably because it's a different model, can at least corroborate what you're saying, but is a generally kind of like unexplored topic in kind of getting what is a perfected RAG system. Again, kind of getting back to the whole idea of like paraphrasing and how you know like a document is like correctly sourced is a complicated question because again, it's very gray. We're doing a lot of circling around today.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I think one thing that I'm thinking about a lot lately and had an interesting conversation with some folks about over the weekend was this idea that analyzing the accuracy of the AI generated responses feels like a pretty straightforward problem. Essentially, how many of the statements delivered from the AI are accurate or grounded in some sort of truth. The other thing, which you kind of alluded to, feels like a much more interesting yet somewhat nebulous and very difficult question to answer is how complete a response is the AI generating, meaning of all the possible answers it could have given me, is it providing me the highest value information? Is it providing me the most kind of thorough answer? And that kind of juxtaposition of accuracy and thoroughness, I think, is going to be something that we continue to see play out, and people will do the thorough aspect significantly better than other people. And so, obviously we hope to be one of those actors that does that very well. But I do think that is a kind of, in some ways, a constantly moving target, and a lot of research and work is needed kind of in that area, and saying, how do we make AI systems that are not just accurate and grounded in truth, but also that are delivering the highest impact, the most valuable information time and time again across many, many context, right? Many domains, those things. Zach or Shashi, anything to add to the RAG discussion?
Yeah, I think kind of two thoughts along that. One is we talk about using the words stochastic and deterministic are very academic words to talk about what we're talking about here. Basically, LLMs generate things somewhat at random instead of being deterministic and generating things that come out the same way every time. When you want solid, concrete evidence, you want it to come out the same way every time. However, some of the benefits and some of the cool things LLMs can do is because they do something at random. When you regenerate a response, it uses a different little random nugget such that it spits out something a little bit different, which allows for like different types of creativity, allows for different ways of looking at something, allows it to reconsider a question if you don't like the first answer you get. So I think that just want to clarify that it's not inherently bad that these things give you somewhat random responses. It's actually somewhat a feature, while at other times it can be a bug. So that's just kind of one thing I wanted to keep in mind there. I had another thread to run with there, but I forgot that one. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Is RAG, is it a binary utilization, or are there materially better and worse RAG implementations? And if there are better and worse ones, what are the things that lead to a really sharp, accurate RAG implementation versus one that's less precise?
Yeah, I would with the name of RAG, the way as I break it down is the retrieval is of course crucial. If your system sucks at search over whatever corpus of information you're trying to cover, it's going to be a bad generation system just because it doesn't get the right stuff, right? There's pieces of RAG that are fundamentally just correct prompting. Every time, even with a GPT, right? Let's say you've plugged in some set of features to it and you have an API, right? Every GPT is doing RAG, even if your function isn't. Because what it's doing is it's looking at, hey, I have this search for papers endpoint. I have this read paper endpoint. I have explore literature map endpoint. What's happening every time a GPT does that is that it's exploring the descriptions you've given, seeing which one seems the most relevant to any given request, pulling that in, and then generating an API hit, right? And so even every single context that RAG comes up, it feels like a lot of it is very specific to what your objective is, right? Because RAG, in this case, where you're trying to generate API hits, is objectively worse if the output of that doesn't actually create a valid API hit, right? Whereas something in our case where we have source data, a user might find it very, very subjective as to is this a good summary? Is this talking about the document the way that I care about? That sort of thing. In general, there's a lot of proof for systems that kind of do this thing called re-ranking, where you take a user query, you do a semantic embedding, meaning every question, every document that you've retrieved turns into a mathematical representation, and you re-rank that result to then get okay, there's 70 things I found that might be relevant. Let me make sure it's just kind of a final step before I generate, match these documents precisely to what the user's asking for. But there's obviously a lot of steps in there where the retrieval can be modified because the order of it matters so much. The generation can be modified by having prompts at many different places that change what is being generated. So it's mostly, again, it feels case by case where how you choose to generate, how you choose to prompt, and how you choose to sort your results matters a lot.
I think to kind of take that along the thread of how do you determine what's good, what's bad. So Lexi brought up some things you can do from a technical standpoint in doing experiments and such. Something that we have the ability to do as a company that's kind of building in public right now is we're getting constant user feedback. So we're almost crowdsourcing our feedback of is our system good, is it not? That's some of what we saw in some of the early kind of user feedback forms, so that the search wasn't necessarily returning what people thought it should be. So that gave us the opportunity to say, all right, that retrieval aspect, the database we're using, we need to add some more things to that. We need to make sure that we're interacting with it correctly. So that's kind of a fun way of doing this in the crowdsourced manner, is we're getting real-time feedback. People are using the tool and then giving us, what they think works well, what doesn't. So we get to see that. Very much less academic. It is not a percentile comparison of one generation versus another. But we do get to see is how is this tool providing use for people? And that's one indicator of is this RAG system sufficient or not?
I think that's well said, Zach. I think in many ways, the kind of final benchmark for a lot of these systems is how much value are we returning to users, and are any of these systems returning to users? And so long as we continue to operate in that space, that feels like we're going to kind of find or derive the winning formula, even if we don't have the exact precise formula down right this second. And for anyone else just listening in who would like to learn about RAG further, there's obviously various outlets online, but there are several blogs at ScholarAI.io that we encourage you to go check out, so you can kind of further your understanding of not only the RAG systems that we use, but other RAG systems that are used kind of across the industry as well. With that, I think I'm going to wrap today's pod. We are kind of at time. Thanks everyone, as always, for joining us. Please find us at all of the standard podcast locations, and please check out our YouTube channel, subscribe, and leave your comments in the thread below, and we will be sure to get to them in our next conversation next week. See you all soon.